Hello, I'm Katie, and welcome to the Season 2 finale of Retromade. Today, we wrap up the long journey through the writing and directing works of John Hughes in the 80s and 90s. Let's first go through the numbers of the season. We covered 30 movies, 8 that John Hughes wrote and directed, and 22 that he wrote but did not direct. I was lucky enough to have 25 guest co-hosts join me. Thank you to you all. Somebody had to come on and bring some class to the show. So thank you all. You all know who you are. I cannot thank you enough for joining me this season. Now, we covered John Hughes' works in the 80s and 90s. So that from 1980 to 1999, there were only 3 years that were not actually represented in the season. 1999, because his last movie that we covered that he wrote and produced was in 1998, in the 90s. But also there was no movie released in 1995 or 1981. But he made up for that because there were 3 movies released in a single year, and there were 3 years that happened. So the following years had 3 movies released. 1983, Mr. Mom, Vacation, and Nathan Hayes, aka Savage Islands. Also, 1985 was a big one. That was The Breakfast Club, Weird Science, and European Vacation. And then 1991, Career Opportunities, Dutch, and Curly Sue. There's another group of 3. John actually had uncredited cameos in 3 movies. Does anybody remember? Definitely The Breakfast Club as Brian's dad. That's probably the one you all know. But also the National Lampoon's Class Reunion, which none of you probably saw. But if you listen to the episode, you'll remember that I had said that he played the girl with the paper bag on her head that ended up being the murderer. And then also in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, he is the man running between cabs. Now, of those 30 movies that we covered, let's just quickly talk through them in the order of release date. The season did not go in order, obviously. What I did was when my guests came on, I gave them the choice of what movie they wanted to select. So it did not go in order. So here we are. In 1980, we have The Secret Life of Nikola Tesla. Then in 82, Class Reunion, National Lampoon's. In 83, Mr. Mom, Vacation, Nathan Hayes. 1984 was 16 Candles. Then 85, The Breakfast Club, European Vacation, and Weird Science. 86, there were 2 movies, Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Pretty in Pink. Also 2 movies in 1987, Some Kind of Wonderful, as well as Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. 2 more in 88, She's Having a Baby and The Great Outdoors. 2 more in 89, Uncle Buck and Christmas Vacation. 1 in 1990 with the big blockbuster that was Home Alone. 91, Career Opportunities, Dutch and Curly Sue. 92 had 2 movies, Beethoven and Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. Dennis the Menace was in 93. And then 94, also 2 movies, Baby's Day Out and Miracle on 34th Street, the remake. 96, we had the live action remake of 101 Dalmatians. And then 2 in 97, Flubber and Home Alone 3. And then lastly, the one we just covered that was released in 1998, that also no one probably saw, Reach the Rock. Okay, I'm sure you all have favorites. I'm sure that I brought some, I hope anyway, that I brought some of these to your attention. And if you haven't seen them and they are at least somewhat easy to find, that you have opened your viewership to some of these lesser known Hughes movies, or maybe you didn't realize that some of these were Hughes movies. We'll get to that. So ranking wise, It's kind of difficult. I think from a, again, best movie versus favorites are a little different. In this case, I think my favorite is also the best, The Breakfast Club. But then followed very closely in terms of my favorites is Weird Science. And then I would say Ferris Bueller's Day Off, third, and then followed closely by Mr. Mom and Home Alone. So it's kind of my top five. Least favorites, if you've been paying attention to the season at all, you know that I absolutely hated Flubber. So that is 100% my least favorite. And then I guess a little bit surprisingly, because Reach the Rock actually had a fairly good, I want to say 6.6, if I remember correctly, IMDb rating, probably based on very few ratings. But while it's not the worst movie, I just feel like from an enjoyment perspective, I put this as my second least favorite because if you asked me to rewatch any of the 30, I would pick, aside from Flubber, I would pick that one second to last. So I would probably rather, if I had to, even some that I didn't love, I would rewatch some of the others over Reach the Rock. So those are my favorites and least favorites. The highest rating from an IMDb perspective, we have two that have a 7.8 IMDb rating, and that is, of course, The Breakfast Club and then Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Actually, I'm sorry, there was three that had a 7.8, also Home Alone. The worst, let's see. There's two movies that have a tied for the worst IMDb rating, which is a 4.6, and that is Class Reunion, National Lampoon's, and Home Alone 3. So there we go. That's what I thought. That's what IMDb thought. If you guys have thoughts, I'm sure we all agree on some of them, but there might be surprises out there. Does anyone share my rankings exactly? Or were there any surprises for you guys? Any that you did not think you were going to like and you ended up enjoying, or vice versa? More so, as we talked through in the episodes, I was starting to discover a lot of running themes, some observations, and some connections. So I wanted to talk through those with you guys today. Definitely the Chicago of it all. This is a living, breathing character. Hughes created this idealized romantic mythos of this windy city. His lens cast a spell that made the snow-draped suburbs, the towering skyline, and iconic landmarks like Wrigley Field, the Art Institute of Chicago, obviously the skyline and Michigan Avenue. He made them feel like the ultimate, this magical landscape of American life. And he spent essentially 2 decades directing what was essentially the most beautiful, heartfelt tourism campaign ever. And it worked. It is likely no coincidence that Chicago is my favorite American city. Anyone else think that John Hughes maybe had a hand in that? Maybe a little bit? Speaking of which, advertising plays a fairly significant role in Hughes movies. So he was pulling from his own background in advertising. As we've talked about in some of the episodes, he used to be an ad man in the 70s, I want to say. And so we see this pop up in a few different ways in Hughes movies. One of which obviously is the careers that some of the characters have. So Caroline in Mr. Mom, Neil in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Jake in She's Having a Baby. There's also pretty heavy-handed product placement in a lot of movies. Just a quick example would be Pepsi in Home Alone, and a lot of memorable catchphrases in Hughes movies. So memorable catchphrases, slogans, and taglines. There's so many famous lines of dialogue that Hughes structured in like a brilliant, very sticky advertising copy. So it's designed to live in your head forever. For example, life moves pretty fast from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And again, this I think is another example that I didn't realize, but perhaps he also planted a seed in my young brain. since this is what I do for a living now. I will say that this is a kind of a running trope in 80s movies, seemingly. There's a lot of advertising and marketing in movies from the 80s, and it is shown to be far more glamorous than it actually is. So, yeah, wish I'd known that. No, I'm just kidding. It is what it is. But music is also huge in Hughes movies, a little bit pulling from his ad background in the way that he used music. So he's got a jingle mindset, it seems. So using music in similar ways that you would in a jingle or in ads to evoke emotion and get your point across. So some scenes in these movies seems like they're treated like high-end commercials a little bit, pairing these really stylized imagery with infectious, unforgettable audio, quote unquote, jingles, shall we say. Again, a lot of these memorable lines, the use of music, the use of a single musical cue, like Simple Minds in The Breakfast Club or Yellow in Ferris Bueller. It was used to instantly broadcast a character's internal unspoken feelings to us as the audience. The soundtracks in Hughes movies were definitely not something that he thought of in post-production. He apparently famously wrote scripts with headphones on, but this totally makes sense because he lets music clearly dictate the emotional rhythm and pacing and structure of a lot of his scenes. Like I just mentioned, for example, the Simple Minds in The Breakfast Club or a lot in Ferris Bueller, just to name a few examples. And I would say this is, again, more so early on in his career. He rejected traditional sweeping Hollywood orchestral scores in favor of more underground British new wave or punk rock, alternative pop. So he's creating a very distinct brand that captured a very specific, anxious heartbeat of 1980s youth culture. And that was synonymous with Hughes movies, like I said, more so earlier in his career. So music was really big. He was a big rock fan, and we'll get to that in a little bit with another category. But it's not all roses. There's a common theme of the negative portrayal of quote unquote career women. Hughes very clearly championed a highly traditional neoconservative family structure, portraying women who opt out of marriage or motherhood as cold, emotionally bankrupt corporate sharks who must be humbled and saved by a family unit. You've heard me talk about this. I will let it go now. But also, there's maybe not so great is maybe a bit of racism by omission. It wasn't just that there were no people of color in his movies, it was that the rare times that they were included, instead of giving them depth or like human characteristics, he traded them for more structural stereotypes like Long Duck Dong in 16 Candles, or it's like a caricature. For example, the caricature bars of Weird Science. Also, he did name the male characters in She's Having a Baby, Jefferson and Davis. We'll get into some more name stuff in a little bit, but I just had to bring that up because, we have to take the good with the bad. We have to take the bad with the good, I should say. But another theme that we see throughout the vast majority of his movies, almost all of them, incorporate classism, right? So he seems obsessed with this whole idea of being from the wrong side of the tracks and this form of wealth gap in the 80s. In the 90s, he pivots to a more literal version in terms of displacement and poverty, this disparity, more so in the 90s movies like The Pigeon Lady and Home Alone 2, Curly Sue, Dutch. We see some of that. So I don't think I need to say anymore. Everybody is aware of the classism that is so prevalent in Hughes movies. But let's get back to names because that's fun. I don't know why I find character names in movies or just the way that names come about really interesting. Maybe it's just me, but a lot of them were extremely deliberate character names in Hughes movies. A lot of times he would pull from his own life, local Chicago history or using them kind of as shorthand for the character's personality. One theme is Chicago architecture and street names. The McAllister family in Home Alone comes from McAllister Avenue, which is a prominent street in the North Shore Chicago suburbs near where Hughes lived and also filmed. And we talked about this pretty recently in the Some Kind of Wonderful episode. He brought again a lot of his love of rock and roll here. So some inspiration for the names came from the Rolling Stones. So Keith, Watts, and Amanda Jones. This is the central love triangle, the characters in this love triangle. So it's a big Easter egg for rock fans in the know. So he clearly named Keith after Keith Richards, and Watts, who the character plays drums, after Charlie Watts, the drummer of Rolling Stones. And also Amanda Jones is pulled directly from the Rolling Stones song, Amanda Jones. And I did not know that song was a Rolling Stones song previously, which was a surprise to me because I like the Rolling Stones, but I thought that the song was written for the movie. No, vice versa. So I thought that was super fun. And then, as you would imagine, he's pulling from real life people that he knows, classmates, etc. So Ducky in Pretty in Pink was based on a real person that he went to high school with at Glenbrook North High School, where he went by the nickname Ducky. Also, a lot of the names like Johnson and Baker, these kind of default names that they're just pretty generic. He frequently would pull from his high school yearbooks. So Brian Johnson in The Breakfast Club, Samantha Baker, 16 Candles. This also helped to give those characters a very authentic, unglamorous Midwestern realism. And then we have to discuss his pseudonym. I think it only came up in the Beethoven episode, but he uses it in some future movies that we don't cover on this season. But his pseudonym comes from classic literature. So when he wanted to distance himself from some commercial work that he was maybe less proud of, he used the pseudonym Edmond Dantes. And this is the main character from The Count of Monte Cristo. So he used that to write scripts, like I said, from Beethoven, and then later, like Drobit Taylor and Made in Manhattan. Those are Edmond Dantes' works. And this is a bit also just to signal, again, everything is purposeful. This is signaling that he felt like a prisoner of his own Hollywood success. Maybe not. I don't know. And then there's also a very common running theme in more so his later movies. Incompetent, petty criminals comes up a lot. So this serves a few purposes, right? Slapstick punching bag. The fact that they're incompetent and they're petty criminals offers this low stakes threat. So we're not in fear that somebody's going to actually be harmed. It's a bit of a scapegoat, I guess. He usually writes them as uneducated blue-collar outcasts, which is in stark contrast to the wealthy suburban families that they try to disrupt. So I think there's something to be said there as well. Now, we cannot forget some of the recurring characters that we see casting favorites in this universe that Hughes has built. So his original muses, of course, are Molly Ringwald and Anthony Michael Hall. And then we also see a lot of John Candy, and we can always take more of John Candy. Macaulay Culkin, Edie McClurg, Ali Sheedy, Larry Hankin, John Ashton, Paul Gleason, Lyman Ward, Robert Prosky, Neil Flynn, Fred Thompson, Eddie Bracken, Joan Plowright, William Wyndham, and Ben Stein. I'm sure there's more. So if I'm forgetting someone, please let me know. But those are the ones that I could think of, just running through the movies and some commonalities. So clearly some favorites that he liked to work with. Unfortunately, there's not really any awards to talk about. No major award nominations, unless you count the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards. He was nominated in both 93 and 97 for Dennis the Menace and Flubber, respectively. But I did think perhaps we could talk about a movie that we didn't talk about on the season because it didn't qualify. John Hughes did not write or direct this movie, but he did produce it, and it has tons of Hughes alumni. The movie that I'm referring to here, it's adjacent in the universe. We'll talk about why. So it's called Only the Lonely from 1991. It also must be out of print because it was hard to watch. So I don't think it's currently on streaming, but maybe some of you remember seeing it from back in the day, or perhaps have an old copy of a VHS or DVD or something like that. But I watched it recently for the first time. It stars John Candy, who plays a Chicago cop, including the accent, Ali Sheedy, and she plays the daughter of a mortician, and she, at the mortician, the funeral home, I was like, what is it called? The mortician shop. The funeral home, she does the makeup of the people in their caskets. Now, Jim Belushi plays Candy's partner, and remember, he was in Curly Sue, also from 1991, the same year. And some other people from the same world are screen legends Maureen O'Hara, and she's doing an Irish accent in this. And the reason that she's somewhat related to the universe is that she played Dory in the original Miracle on 34th Street. And we talked about her a little bit in the remake. And then also screen legend Anthony Quinn is in this, and he's doing a Greek accent. So we've got a lot of accents happening in this movie. We also get, briefly, but we get Macaulay and Kieran Culkin. They play Candy's nephews. And then this, you might be wondering, who wrote this? Who directed this? It is, in fact, somebody very close to the universe. Anyone have any guesses? Or maybe you know. It's Chris Columbus. He wrote and directed this. So it's very adjacent. So it almost qualifies to be in the season, but it doesn't. I can't believe I hadn't seen it. It's good. It's not great. It's good. Now, what did we not get? Because he was such a prolific writer, kind of notoriously so, but we could have had some of these and we did not get projects that he wrote but never came to fruition. There are several, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. We don't have time for that. But there are a few that came up in discussions throughout the season also, but here are some that I personally thought sounded interesting and I kind of wish we would have got, or would have been interesting to see how it came together. A live action Peanuts film. So apparently Warner Brothers acquired the film rights to make this live action Charlie Brown film, with Hughes set to both produce and write. And that was supposed to be in 1993. Then we have Tickets. This is about teens who wait overnight for free tickets to a farewell concert. I can see him doing a lot with this. That would have been 96. And then The Grigsbys Go Broke is about a wealthy family, who loses their fortune, forcing them to move to the other side of the tracks again. And because this is like so John Hughes, I just thought it would have been interesting to see what he does with that as well. That would have been 2003. But I saved the best for last. It would have been in 91. Called Bartholomew versus Neff. That's my dog yawning, sorry. This would have been a vehicle that would have starred Sylvester Stallone and John Candy as feuding neighbors. I am pissed that we didn't get this movie. I want it. I can't quite picture those two together, but love John Candy, love Sylvester Stallone. Put them together, feuding neighbors. What is not to love? Anyone else even heard of this, Bartholomew versus Neff? I can't believe we didn't get it. I don't know. If somebody can get their hands on it and make it come to light, let's resurrect this screenplay here. Unfortunately, John Hughes cannot do that because sadly, he did pass away at a very young age from a heart attack. He passed on August 6th, 2009. He was only 59. Last season, we had to talk about Patrick dying so young as well. These people don't even make it to 60. Legends, I tell you. All right, we can't let this finale go by without talking about what I learned. What did we learn through this journey? A lot, I will tell you. I certainly was not an expert when I started this. I didn't even really have a particularly close attachment to John Hughes. I just knew and loved several of his teen movies that seemed synonymous with the Brat Pack era, and the 1980s. So I love the idea of this shared universe in fictional Chicago suburb called Shermer. I even used it in the subtitle of the season. I knew that he had some other family-oriented movies that kind of went into the 90s that I also liked, like Home Alone. So I thought, perfect. This is a perfect fit for the show. It'll be a fun little venture. Well, it turns out I was unwittingly undertaking a much larger and more surprising odyssey through his work. Look, I still don't claim to be any kind of authority on John Hughes, even after covering 30 of his films, doing a whole season that lasted a long time. I've been doing this for a long time now. But I will tell you, in doing that, I definitely picked up on some motifs through doing the season. So let's talk through what some of those are. There are some unexpected but very clear evolutions. The 80s characters in John Hughes films seem to be trapped by social structures, while the 90s movies that he made became much more literal by trapping characters, like literally trapping characters inside houses and toy stores or city streets, etc. So that is a clear evolution. We also have the misunderstood adult villain. Now, this I find really, I don't know, interesting because now I'm an adult, right? So we look back on these movies with a little bit of a different lens. So we have Principal Rooney in Ferris Bueller, Vice Principal Vernon in The Breakfast Club. They seem like pure villains to kids, right? Rewatching as an adult reveals something very different, that these men seem to be really tragic characters that are burnt out on life. And it's just kind of a terrifying reminder to the teens of what happens when you let the world crush your spirit, as happens, as we'll talk about this in a little bit, but this seems to be hard to not have happen as you get older, right? We're always like looking back on teenagers or young adults like, oh, how cute. You know, they haven't been crushed by the world yet, right? Or life. Adulting is hard, you know, it really is. So we find these characters that as kids we thought were the villains, quote unquote, and now that we find them much more relatable. So I don't know what that says about us, but I think it's sadly at least somewhat true. You know, it's too bad we got a good old stallion, right? And this is eloquently and simply stated by Allison in The Breakfast Club. She says, "It's unavoidable. It just happens. When you grow up, your heart dies." Reflecting the group's fear of becoming like their parents and losing their unique identities. Hey, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Also, wow, that's heavy, but again, like, I don't know, man. Yeah, a little bit. Again, but that's his earlier works, the 80s. A lot of this nuance is gone, completely evaporated into the 90s, trading this very complex, flawed authority figure like Rooney and Vernon for cartoonish, indestructible punching bags like the Wet Bandits. So this leads to the next point that became so evident as I was going through this. Again, this evolution from character study to blueprint maker. And it's, like I said, it hit me in the face because it's so obvious and prevalent as we go through his works. When he directed his own scripts in the 80s, he focused very heavily on dialogue, long pauses, facial expressions, and those character-driven soundtracks. But when he stopped directing and focused solely on writing and producing in the 90s, his scripts became blueprints for directors to execute high-concept action, losing the quiet human moments that defined his early work. And this is the tragic irony, right? It seems that the very skills he learned as a 1970s Chicago ad man, how to package nostalgia, hook an audience, and repeat a winning formula, are exactly what swallowed his artistry in the 90s, transforming him from a director who used commercials to sell cinema into a corporate writer who used cinema to sell a product. John Hughes seemed to have transitioned from a soulful director capturing the authentic heartbeat of youth into a formulaic hit factory, recycling his own tropes for a paycheck. And isn't that the ultimate irony, given Allison's quote that we just talked about in The Breakfast Club about it being inevitable that your heart dies? What do we think about this? When I first kicked off this season of Retromade, I set out in search of pure, comfortable nostalgia. What I actually uncovered across John Hughes' massive 80s and 90s filmography was something far more complicated: the portrait of a brilliant, deeply flawed filmmaker. Hughes didn't just write movies. He built an enduring cinematic universe out of high-gloss advertising slogans, infectious British new wave beats, and of course, a romanticized vision of Chicago that permanently changed how an entire generation viewed the American Midwest, myself included. He gave a profound, serious voice to the quiet, emotional architecture of teen angst, proving that the small-scale heartbreaks of high school were, in fact, worthy of the big screen. Yet, as I traced his career into the 1990s, I couldn't ignore the tragic shift where his passion seemingly dissolved into that goddamn formulaic factory that I talk about all the time in the shows. So he's trading raw human character studies for indestructible, cartoonish slapstick. Looking at his legacy with modern eyes also forced me to confront some glaring blind spots. From a blindingly white suburban universe that practiced a quiet racism by omission to a rigid conservative worldview that routinely penalized independent women. But even with those deep structural flaws, the magic of his peak work refuses to fade. Hughes understood the baseline human desire to be seen and understood, and that is exactly why these films still hold a mirror to our lives now, decades later. I do want to give a massive heartfelt thanks to every single one of you for joining me on this wild nostalgic ride through the highs and lows of Shermer, Illinois. Exploring these classics together has completely transformed the way that I view cinema, how I watch movies, how I view them, the lens, a much more critical eye, both good and bad. And on a personal note, it permanently cemented my own real-world love affair with the city of Chicago. While I am turning the page on this chapter, Retromade is going to take a little intermission, allowing me to step back before deciding where our little pop culture time machine might head next. Please make sure to stay subscribed, though, so that you will get notifications if and when the new episodes drop, please. Now, if you love dissecting these films with me and want to help keep the tape rolling, please consider supporting the show. You can make a massive difference right now by hitting that follow button if you haven't already, if you're new to the show somehow listening to this episode. Also, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can share your favorite episode with a movie-loving friend. And if you want to show a little extra love and appreciation for the season, a small monetary tip does go a long way. You can do that through the last link in the show notes or directly at retromade.captivate.fm/support. Oh, and take a page out of the Hughes playbook and remember, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. Thank you all for listening. And until next time, be kind, rewind.